Action.
Hi. I'm making this video for Jesse and my friends at the University of Minnesota, just to, as an adjunct to try to describe the problem I'm trying to solve. You have to forgive me because I'm beginning to write my thoughts for the grant write-up, and I'm trying to explain to you what happens in the surgeon's brain in the OR that's led to this type of thinking to try to help solve the problem. So I'll be doing a couple total hip replacements this coming week, and generally speaking, when I go to impact the acetabular cup into the pelvis or into the acetabulum, what will happen is that I will align the cup where I want. I will have reamed the acetabulum by approximately 1 millimeter under ream, so the cup will be 1 millimeter larger, and to obtain a press fit. And basically, I stand like this. I get my alignment the way I want, either with an A-frame or I also use navigation. Some people use C-arm. And I basically, I don't know if you can see this, the impaction plate. I take the 2-pound mallet and I bang on it while I'm looking at the A-frame and I'm looking at the navigation. I'm trying to assess my alignment, and I'm producing a force, a magnitude of force that is inconsistent, it's not the same, and I'm hitting at different parts of this impaction plate, which is creating different torque with every blow of the mallet. And basically, I'm trying to apply force, I'm trying to assess my fixation strength. And the other problem that I've kind of written about in my paper is that I'm obsessed as a surgeon with full seating of the cup, but many times what happens is there's a conflict. I can see that I can't fully seat the cup. It's not fully seated, but the pitch on this thing has become very low, and I have a good feel, I have a good tactile feel, and it just feels like it's as far down as it will go. So there's a conflict between full seating and what I feel and listen for as a good fixation. So if you come here, I want to kind of show you what I've done on the board here. And so this is the problem when we apply force in orthopedics. Of course, it has a components of magnitude and direction. And when the surgeon applies the force, we really have no control over the magnitude. It could be with every blow, we're creating a different magnitude. And we're hitting on different parts of the impaction plate, so we're creating different directions with that. So this part is very primitive. And for another video, I was showing that the mallet and the hammer and the rock are very similar to each other. And the other issue is that when the surgeon applies force as a cause, it produces the effects of fixation and alignment. And when we go to assess our fixation, we're basically doing what I just talked about. We're feeling and we're listening for a pitch. So our assessment of the fixation is with our eyes. We're looking for full seating. With our ears, the pitch, and tactile, very important. We frequently stop and ask the people in the OR, does that feel like it's down to you? Okay, so this process as application, assessment, and the end point, as I talked about in my paper, these are all very primitive, and our goal is to try to improve on these things. So right now, the surgeon produces a force. He's not or she's not quite sure what the end point is that she wants. Does she want full seating, or does she want a good feel of fixation? And basically, she uses her eyes, ears, and tactile sense to assess this fixation. So what we're proposing is, let's do something better than the mallet as far as application of force. And I have recommended in my thoughts and ideas 3 different methods: controlled impaction, vibration, and push, constant insertion. We're going to focus on this paper and grant on our controlled impaction. And as far as the assessment of the effect of force, we're going to, instead of our eyes, ears, and tactile, which is not standard, try to come up with a mechanism which would describe invasive sensing to assess fixation. So it's the same for everybody, and not dependent on the surgeon's mood or his or her power. Invasive sensing, and we've come up with the idea, best fixation short of fracture, which is, we've defined an endpoint here. So instead of this conflict that exists between full seating and a good feel, we've defined an endpoint that's technological. It's just a number or a parametric value. Just quickly about vibration and push, these are some other projects that we'd like to work on, and these are really, I'm going off tangent, but this is one of our vibratory tools, and vibration is very cool because not only can you control the magnitude of force, you can control the direction of force, and you can actually, while you're inserting, you can change the alignment to exactly what you want. But that's not our subject of discussion today, nor are we going to focus on controlling direction. This is all about controlling magnitude and trying to standardize application and standardize fixation. So, and you have a value here, number value, that gives you a sense of where when you should stop applying force and when you should stop increasing force. So back to this. So we're basically, in the most basic way of improving on the mallet, we've described it as controlled impaction, which is a mass sliding over a rod, which would create an energy or work Newton meters. And this is a prototype which we'll be using this weekend. So instead of a mallet, it's the same concept. We can have the A-frame here. We could use navigation, or we could use C-arm. But the concept is that instead of the mallet hitting on different parts of the impaction plate, you have a mass that's sliding over the rod that's hitting on the impaction plate. It's perfectly actually. Also, you can quantify the energy or the force or the impulse here and keep it exactly the same. So this is basically the concept of controlled impaction, where the energy or the impulse or the force you're producing on this side is maintained completely constant. Now, so the idea is that with this method now, you can sort of, with the invasive sensing method, instead of using your senses, you can access the interface. You can get a value of the interface and process that and use that information to produce this action, get this value off the interface, process it, and this is a closed loop now. This is sort of the surgeon is completely disconnected with the patient's body. This system allows the surgeon to create a closed loop between herself, the patient, the prosthesis bone interface, and the patient, back and forth. So this is a closed loop, but that's what we want to do with this thing here. So what we know, some of the work that Jesse and I have done together, and also with other engineers, what we know is that when you take a mallet, metal, bang it on the impaction plate, and bang that cup into the pelvis, there's a hard object hitting on a hard object, hitting on a soft object. So hard, hard, soft. And I think we would all agree that this collision is elastic. These are both hard objects. So there's conservation of momentum and conservation of kinetic energy. This collision initially is inelastic. There is a conservation of momentum, but the kinetic energy initially some of it is lost into work of insertion or heat. But so as you keep doing that, for certain, if you could keep your applied force, or what we've described as F1 constant, over multiple impacts, this collision between the cup and the bone goes from inelastic to becoming more and more elastic, and eventually, for a given applied force, you get so much insertion, and when you don't get any more insertion, this collision has also been converted to elastic. So it's now elastic. So what we found out is that, and I use this analogy here, is that it's like billiard ball here. Billiard, tennis ball. Here, during the middle impactions, it's billiard, baseball, and eventually it's billiard, and billiard ball. So it goes from the interface between the prosthesis and bone goes from inelastic to elastic. So we kind of measured this in our experiments that, with 2,000 newtons of force, you get half of that cup inserted, maybe 4 millimeter insertion, and you won't get any further insertion after that. So it goes from inelastic to elastic. And what we found out was that these are some of the measurements we took. If you measure the force in the bone, or the bone substitute, and you compare it to the force that you are applying, as this force approaches this force, basically the collision becomes inelastic. So as F5, what's felt in the bone, approaches the applied force, the collision becomes elastic. And what we found out is that the lower your applied force is, the larger number of impacts it takes for F5 to approach F1. So this is, for example, we've written here, for 2,000 newtons of consistently applied force, most of that force initially goes to work of insertion. As insertion becomes less and less, more of that force is felt in the bone, and ultimately the force that's felt in the bone and the force that's applied are about equal. And you can see that when there's a larger applied force, it takes less number of impacts for F5 to approach F1. And at very large forces, it takes just a few impacts for F5 to approach F1. These are some numbers that, some of this stuff we've measured, some of it I've basically extrapolated, but the idea here is just to show the concept for you. So again, we have some of these that we will kind of, you will see in the papers that we've shown, is that as insertion basically goes to 0, the F5 approaches the F1. Now, another way of looking at this is basically, again, when we plotted applied force versus cup insertion, we got this graph which we termed the resistive force. And in this graph, basically, we will talk about it in a second, but we described 3 sections where there's sort of poor insertion and poor pull-out force. B spot where we said good insertion, good pull-out force, and the C, what we labeled C, where there is very little insertion and for a lot of additional force, very little insertion. We'll talk about that. But what you see again here is, if you measure F5 and you apply F1, as these two approach each other, this system, this collision goes from inelastic to elastic. And when you have approached sort of, when the prosthesis and the bone are elastic now, this area defines basically a level of insertion and a level of radial strain that, based on the stress-strain curve, defines a force normal, X being the strain and force normal being the stress. And that force normal multiplied by coefficient of static friction will define the pull-out force if you're trying to pull this out. So another way of looking at F5 approach to F1 is simply measuring the delta F5, or the first derivative of F5 in relation to the number of impacts. So as the delta F5 approaches 0, basically you know you're not inserting. So we contemplated this a good way to try to figure out how to incrementally increase your force. You choose an F1, and as you apply it, you monitor F5. As F5 approaches F1, or as the delta F5, or first derivative of F5, approaches 0, you know that for the chosen applied force, you stopped inserting. So you can go a packet up, you can go to 2000 newtons, do the same thing. And you will see the same thing. Initially, the F5, the measured force in the bone is low, and as it becomes higher and higher, and it becomes equal to 2000 Newton, or again, if the delta F5 approaches 0, you're not inserting. So this, and you can keep increasing the packets, and this is a way for us to access the interface. You're applying the force, you know there's initial insertion occurring, and you know when insertion stops. And you can make the binary decision to increase the force again. And you could do this systematically until you decide to stop. Now, what we also realized is that as you increase the force, F1, the F5 approaches F1 faster and faster and faster. And so this is the sort of the graph that I think Jesse and I created theoretically. But measuring F5, when the force is lower, there's more number of impacts. It takes longer for F5 or delta F5 to approach 0. And as the force is increased, it takes it's faster and faster. And eventually, when you increase F1 to a certain number, F5 will approach F1 instantaneously, or just described as step function. When this happens, when the step function happens, which we've tried to show here, for example, we showed here 1000 newtons, it takes a lot of impacts, and you see the delta F5, or the first derivative of measured impact force. As it approaches 0, you know you're not inserting, and you can increase this 1000 newtons incrementally. But at some theoretical, we haven't measured this, but we like to do that. At some value of F1, the delta F5 will be immediately or instantaneously 0. So we believe that this, the rate of approach of F5 to F1 gives us sort of a indication of the stress-strain behavior of the edge of the bone and the ring, excuse me. So this is sort of an algorithm that we'd like to follow. So for any given F1, as the delta F5 goes to 0, insertion stops, then you can increase F1 and again monitor delta F5, and as delta F5 goes to 0, insertion stops. So you can continue this until, and you will realize that the F5 will approach, as you increase the force, F5 will approach F1 faster and faster, and ultimately F5 will approach F1 instantaneously and with a step function. Of course, that gives you an indication to stop and do not increase F1. So how fast F5 approaches F1 is an indication of the depth of insertion. So you have two measurement values, F5, F1. The first relationship it basically tells you whether you should increase force or not, and the second derivative or second relationship tells you it gives you a sense of depth of insertion. It gives you a sort of an indication of this strain that you're putting at the rim of the pelvis of the acetabulum, and of course of the corresponding stress stress that you're producing, or force normal. So let's come back here to summarize, and I apologize if I'm becoming wordy. I'm just trying to get this concept out. We basically applied force to a cup to insert it to acetabulum to insert it into a bone substitute, and we measured applied force versus insertion. We got this kind of curve that we call the FR curve, and we realized that we termed it or we labeled it as having three different zones: A, B, and C. A was basically you had poor insertion and poor pull-out. B, you had good insertion and good pull-out forces, so maybe 70 to 90% insertion and up to 70 to 90% pull-out force. And C was really the final millimeter or two, and for that final millimeter, you had to produce a tremendous increase in applied force, like from 4 kilonewtons to 8 kilonewtons. So we wondered whether it's worthwhile to, for that final millimeter, produce 4,000 newtons of force. And when we plotted applied force versus pull-out force, the pull-out forces being axial pull-out, we realized also that as you increased the applied force, after the B zone, you really didn't get much appreciable increase in pull-out force, so it's also plateaued. So in our experiment with our 20-pound urethane foam, we basically, at maybe 4,000 newtons, we were able to get 9,500 newtons of pull-out force. And we went to much higher, like 6,000 or 7,000 newtons of applied force, and that the pull-out force did not increase with that. So we also kind of plotted insertion of the cup versus pull-out force, and we got the same type of graph. And this graph has a similarity to standard stress strain curve. And so so from here, basically, we were thinking about what happens when you impact the cup into the acetabulum. And our contention is that basically, this is a supposition we have to prove, that when you implant the acetabulum into the prosthesis into the acetabulum, the bone has sort of a rim fixation where the edge of the acetabular bone is like a ring or a spring. And of course, based on Hooke's law, you stretch it and it provides a compressive force. And sort of the bottom part of the acetabulum is basically a sort of force that acts as a retaining wall. So we've driven that here. You're stretching the rim, which acts like a ring, which produces a compressive force based on Hooke's law. And that's sort of the tension forces. And as you keep inserting deeper and deeper, you're beginning to touch the dome. And that's just producing compression. And our contention, or our supposition, is that this part, of course, it does not add much to the pull-out force. So we kind of wrote this formula here. When you're inserting the prosthesis into the acetabulum, the resistive force is a combination of the grasping force that's created by the tension by the ring aspect of the acetabulum. And as you go deeper and deeper, the addition to the resistive force is the compressive force down here, which is simply the normal forces pushing back. So we believe that rim fixation, what happens at the rim, is most of the contribution to press fit, which is what keeps you from pulling out. And that the dome, which creates this obsession for us for full seating, because we're always worried about getting it down, has minimal contribution to press fit. And our obsession to fully seating the cup compromises our rim fixation. So come over here just for a second. When I am doing this, and I cannot fully seat the cup, I'm left with a decision. Should I accept what I feel and what I hear, or should I take this out? And this cup may be a millimeter bigger than this acetabulum. What I may want to do is ream this thing line to line so I can fully seat this. Give up on the rim fixation altogether and just use screws to fix this cup to the acetabulum. So we know that works, and we know some surgeons are very, they like to do that. But of course, you've lost the spring-like quality of bone, you've lost rim fixation or press fit fixation. And we do know that when we put screws in these little holes, that there is micromotion, there's fretting and corrosion, which leads to metallosis, and sometimes the polyethylene leaks through these holes, creates tissue necrosis, osteolysis, and a lot of problems down the line. So the point I have made in the past is that surgeons basically, without knowing why they're doing something, they, because of their propensity to want to fully seat, they will give up on press fit fixation and they'll use screws. Or they may accept that this thing is not fully seated, and generally, we know in the literature what's described as a little polar gap or a little gap there. I don't think that there's a lot of evidence that shows that there's anything wrong with that, and patients generally do very well, even if it's not fully seated. So back to over here, please. So to summarize, here we are producing an F1, and we measure F5. We have measured F5. We know that when these two approach each other, as F5 approaches F1, or as delta F5 goes to 0, that defines an insertion, which defines a radial strain in bone, which, based on the stress-strain curve, defines a corresponding stress, which we will describe as force normal. And this force normal multiplied by coefficient of static friction is really that rim fixation that we have. So if you look at this chart, you'll see that if one of the contentions that we have is that the rate of approach of F5 to F1, how fast this approaches that, is a representation of the elastic and plastic behavior of the rim of the acetabulum. So initially, because the rate of approach is slow, you may be here in the stress-strain curve, moderate, fast, and we know at some point in time F5 will approach F1 instantaneously, and we are supposing the supposition that when F5 approaches F1 instantaneously, that should be close to the ultimate strength point of the rim, and that may be a good indication for the surgeon to stop applying force. So let's come over here and just to summarize into the other room the concepts. Excuse me, did you have a monograph this thing here? Sure. I have made another supposition here, is that, again, there's the two collisions. This is elastic, this goes from inelastic to elastic. And in our experiments, we measured F5 in the bone, or in the bone substitute. And I'm making a supposition that F5 and F2 should be about the same. And I think that we can measure F1 here, again, whether we measure it as a force or unit of energy or impulse. We can measure F1 here in the mallet or here, and we can measure F2 here. Of course, this is interfacing with the soft bone. And I am suggesting that we can measure and calculate F1 we can measure F2 instead of F5, and I suggested they're equal. And we monitor F2 as it approaches F1, or it's almost equivalent to say that we monitor delta F2 as it goes from infinity to 0, the first derivative of F2 in relation to number of impacts. And that will tell you whether you're inserting or not, and that will tell you whether you should increase force or not. It's sort of a binary decision there. And we also monitor the rate of approach of F2 to F1. And this is sort of, you know, like the red shift and the blue shift of the astronomers. Basically, how fast F2 approaches F1 gives you an indication of your depth of your insertion. So if you're a surgeon and you're doing that, and you actually have somebody or some value or some tool telling you your F2 is approaching F1 very, very fast, in your brain that should be an indication that I am close to deep or full seating. And when the F2 approaches F1 instantaneously or immediately, that should be an indication to the surgeon that perhaps I should stop application of force, and that may herald or represent basically the ultimate strength of the rim of the acetabulum. So the first relationship of F1 to F2 gives us the binary decision, increase force or not. The second relationship of F2 to F1 gives us a binary decision to stop application of force or not. Increase force or not, stop application of force or not. And there are secondary ways of monitoring or evaluating the interface, and we've described that in our little write-up, which is to monitor vibrations or the frequency spectra in bone, and monitoring vibrations in the room, which the pitch of sound. And I think these vibrations will have different characteristics, and it will show similar sort of patterns of increasing and then plateauing, and that would be a warning before you should stop increasing force. So we want to point out another thing now. So this press-fit fixation, we're talking about the acetabulum. And we talked a bit about when you insert the acetabulum, we feel that most of the rim fixation, this is what the spring-like quality of the rim is what creates the grasp of bone, and that as you push, if you impact this further and further, and the dome starts to touch here, the forces go up. Now, we have a similar problem with